Hello, my name is Amy Lightfoot. I work for the British Council here in India, and I'm at the 11th Language and Development Conference here in Delhi. And I have with me Bonny Norton, one of our featured speakers from the conference. She's originally from South Africa, but is currently working at the University of British Columbia, where she's a professor and distinguished university scholar working in the Department of Language and Literacy Education. Thank you very much for agreeing to speak to me today. Bonny just very recently completed a session on the African Storybook Project, and we'll put a link to it in the text that accompanies this video, so please do have a look at that. What I wanted to have a chat about, though, is the work that you've done around language and identity and the connection between them, and I wondered if maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that aspect of your work.
Yeah, it's a very exciting area because what I'm trying to do is to reframe understandings of language and also understandings of identity. So that's a huge task. But even, let's just begin with language. When people think about language, they often think about, for example, am I an English speaker, Kiswahili speaker, Hindu speaker, and that is what we would call a linguistic system, and that's interesting. But I'm particularly interested in language as a social practice. How do we relate to one another? Who speaks to whom? Whose voice is heard? Who has power in communication? So that speaks directly to the issue of identity. And sometimes I find that people sometimes confuse it. They say, okay, the person who speaks English has power. Well, not necessarily, because it might depend on what kind of English you speak. It might depend on who you're speaking to, the context in which you're using the language. And in fact, one of the points that I made yesterday, actually, we had the I was reviewing the book Language and Social Cohesion, was in fact what we do all have in common as linguists, even though we have these different theories, is issues of human rights, right? And we are interested in the democratization of language, and that people do feel that they have a sense of ownership of the language, even if they're not a native speaker, for example. And that, is an identity issue. But we have to reframe what we mean by language, and we have to harness like a different theory of identity, the identity as multiple, identity as changing, and as often a site of struggle. Because, what we also find, of course, people sometimes feel, well, if I speak English, am I betraying, my cultural identity? And I don't think that's a helpful way to proceed in this world in which we live. We have to have a different way of theorizing language, where you can speak English and you can speak your mother tongue or your cultural. They are not necessarily mutually exclusive. They can work in complementary ways for different purposes.
Right.
So I think sometimes if you centralize people and you centralize language, I think it takes one into a dead end. So we have to have new ways of thinking about language and identity, so that people kind of can embrace the multiple ways in which they relate to the world. So that's a very exciting relationship between language and identity.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me, and I think it's one of the themes that's really been coming up through the conference is thinking about how language is a tool, and one of the things that we use for communication, which we do in different ways, in different contexts, with different people, and it's not just, if it's this language, then it's this, and everybody who uses it is like this.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah, I think that.
Kind of that essentialist notion. You shouldn't need to apologize, for being a native speaker or non-native speaker. But at the same time, we do need to still take those views seriously, because it does still have impact.
Right.
Because people are positioned, right, in different ways. So that's where I see the role of both research and pedagogy and teaching, is to invite people to think differently about issues of identity, and how do we move beyond the binaries that really have taken people into dark corners.
Yeah, sure. And I think that's interesting. Another thing that we were talking about earlier is about the relationship between the people who are doing the research, the people who are the beneficiaries or the participants in the research. Obviously, hopefully, we're all beneficiaries from the research. Practitioners working in classrooms or in other areas where language is used, and then the policymakers, and how those different things interact. It does seem very complex, and I think, again, as you've said with language, that we sometimes go down dead ends. If we start getting too concerned about, is it having an effect on policy, and then we're only focusing on that, then maybe we lose sight of some of the on-the-ground stuff that's happening. Is that something that you agree with?
What I would say is that what research tells me is that you do need to take very seriously policy and practice, because you can go in as a researcher and encourage, perhaps new methodologies, new approaches, and the teachers might be, sounds very interesting, and when you leave, they close the door and they say, yes, but my salary depends on me, not using the mother tongue or not using English, whatever the policy might be. So in fact, one of the challenges that I don't know if you were at the meeting yesterday when we had all these policymakers, it was all the ministers.
Right, yes, the ministerial panel.
And my challenge to the ministers was, how do we encourage flexibility in policy? Because if teachers, policy often comes down like it's just dropped into schools, unmonitored, and that's the rule, so to speak. That's what teachers see is what they need to do. And that really restricts them in terms of using their own judgment, being more organic in the classroom, looking at what kids are doing that is meaningful. Because in a sense they have that policy, and their jobs may be at stake, right? So my sense is that policymakers do need to be on board, but they also need to be sure that policies are seen as flexible instruments as well. So that's why, I don't know if you saw the image, we've tried to work with policymakers in the Ugandan context too. So so what we're looking at is that a very energetic and productive relationship between policymakers and researchers and practitioners, where we all learn from one another, but we keep it an open conversation, so that in the interest of the children, in the interest of learning. So I do think that engage, like the British Council meeting is great, because we are having lots of conversations, and hopefully people go back to their institutions, go back to their ministries with some new ways of thinking about policy.
And plant some seeds that they've picked up from here.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me again. And as I said at the beginning, we'll put the links to both your African Storybook Project session, which you co-presented with
Mary McKenna.
And also the book launch that you were involved in as a reviewer of language and social cohesion. There was an event on that yesterday, so we'll put a link to that as well for you to take a look at. And the book itself actually is available to download from the Language and Development Conference series website. So again, we'll put a link to that too. Okay, so thanks again for talking to me.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, and thanks for watching.
Okay.